police, ambulance, the whole team are doing an amazing job. There are more than 2,000 emergency services personnel, both volunteer and career, that are out on the ground doing the best of work, putting themselves in harm's way to protect others. And I'll come back to why that's a really important point to make and how we can all make a contribution to keeping those dedicated Victorians safe in just a moment. Then, of course, there are council staff, many from the philanthropic sector, volunteers, other charity groups, and then just ordinary hard-working Victorians who are looking after neighbours and friends, and I want to congratulate and thank all of them. We've seen communities hard hit already, and when we move to both the Bureau's briefing and also Tim Weebush from SES will speak to other communities that are going to have a very, very tough time over coming days. We know just how impressive that sense of connectivity, that sense of community, people looking out for each other, people really stepping up, and I want to thank everybody who's involved in the effort. Doesn't matter what colour uniform you're wearing, everyone is pitching in, and it makes you very proud to be a Victorian at a time of great difficulty. Now, in terms of support we're providing already, there have been some 1,500 Victorians who have applied for emergency payments. emergencypayments.dff.vic.gov.au, or if you've not got an internet provider at the moment, 1800 226 226. There are payments of just over $2,000 for eligible families, and eligible families are those who are out of their home because of this flood event. It's about accommodation, food, clothing, medicine, very practical support for those who need it most. And as I said, there's some 1,500 Victorians who have already made an application via either the phone number or the website. And we're processing those as fast as we can, and we'll have that money out to people as quickly as possible. There are 11 relief centres that have been set up across Victoria. We'll, of course, add to those if we need to. And again, I thank the staff, everyone, volunteers who are making those relief centres real centres of care and support at a very difficult time. Website has all the details, the physical addresses of all of those, and as I said, we will add to those number of relief centres. We've got 50 different sandbag collection points, many volunteers, great team of people who are working very hard. That includes some support from the Australian Defence Force at a local level, I think out of the Bandiana barracks, and we thank them very much for their work. In terms of some other headline numbers, if you like, my most recent update, there's some 4,700 homes that are without power. The largest single group amongst that is Apollo Bay at about 1,500 homes. Everyone's working as hard as they possibly can to reconnect those homes. I think the Apollo Bay event is probably more related to wind rather than water. The rest of that 4,700 are made up of much smaller communities, so I won't go through a full list, but those communities, rest assured, we are working as fast and as hard as we can to reconnect you to power. We still are of the view that there's about 500 homes that have been inundated. There are another 500 homes at least that have been isolated. So when I say homes, properties, maybe more than just a house, maybe in terms of farmland, much bigger parcels of land, but 500 that have got water above the floorboards, and also another 500 that are cut off because of this flood event. That number will definitely grow. We have choppers in the air at the moment making damage assessments, flood impact assessments, that they're fed back in real time. And as you'll hear from Tim in just a moment, particularly in relation to the Goulburn Valley, we're going to see more and more people that fit into that category. That's why it's so important that we're there to provide support, we're there to provide care and attention to keep people safe and to look after those who are doing it very tough. We'll move to that clean-up phase, the recovery phase, at a later point, but this event has obviously well and truly started and will run for a number of days. We won't see peak levels of flood water for quite a while. And of course there is then the other issue of rain events that are forecast in coming weeks. And of course the ground was already sodden before this last couple of days of record rainfall. We know that even moderate rain events over coming weeks will present a real challenge for us as well. So this is with us for a while yet. That's why the preparations, and I want to congratulate Tim, Andrew, the whole team, the work that's been done to work with communities, tens of thousands of different discussions, important one-on-one conversations, forums, handing out material at shows and all sorts of other public events that has served, I think, these now flood-affected communities very well. And I thank all of our emergency services family for the work they've done in pre-positioning generators, in having choppers on standby, sandbags and sand, all of that work. It is a credit to them, and I thank them very much on behalf of the whole Victorian community for the preparatory work that they have done. That's probably enough from me at this point. Sorry, I should just finally, before I ask Diana from the Bureau to take us through just some context of how significant this rainfall event has been, I should just say that not only have I spoken with the Prime Minister this morning, he's assured me that Victorians will receive everything that we need, and I thank him for the very positive partnership that we have to keep people safe and to repair and rebuild after this event. But we've also had a discussion about standing up, both he and I, but also at officials level, standing up the former Mickleham quarantine facility into essentially a Mickleham relief centre. That's purpose-built to house people. There's a power of work going on. We'll update you, keep you informed of that in coming days. But senior officials of my department and the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and the Department of Treasury and Finance at a national level have been working very hard overnight and throughout the morning to make the necessary arrangements. We're making necessary arrangements in terms of the different contractors, the different people we'll need to provide services. But we think, and particularly when you hear Tim take you through some of the expected outcomes over coming days, we think there's every chance that we'll need to house people at that Mickleham facility. Just finally, because I really can't say this enough, two things. Thank you to everyone who is doing such important work. We're very, very grateful to you. And again, it's many people wearing a uniform and many people who don't. Just that sense of people looking out for each other. It should be a great point of pride for every single Victorian to know that we always come together whenever things are difficult, whenever times are tough. And I thank everybody who's making that important contribution. Finally, please do not drive into floodwater. We have had more than 200 rescues, and many of those could have been prevented. And the key point here is it's very dangerous for you, and it's also very dangerous for the emergency services volunteer or career member, that first responder, to come and rescue you. And while you're being rescued, somebody else can't get the support that they need or may have to wait longer. So please don't play in floodwater, and please, we can only request, we can only ask, please don't drive into floodwater. It is incredibly dangerous for you and everybody involved. I'll now ask Diana Eadie from the Bureau of Meteorology to speak to you, then Tim Weebush, and then we're happy to take any questions. Of course, I'm here with the Minister and Commissioner Crisp. Diana.
Thank you, Premier, and good afternoon, everyone. Now, the rain has largely eased, but the flood situation is still very much evolving. I'll start with some of the rainfall totals that we have seen throughout the course of this event, the expected rainfall over the coming week, but today I really want to focus on the current flood situation. Starting with the rainfall over the course of this event, the severe weather warning has now been cancelled for heavy rain and damaging winds. Event totals that we've seen over the last few days: 224 millimetres at Strathbogie North, 212 at Charnwood, both near Euroa, 171 millimetres across the Central Highlands at Avalon Station, and 166 millimetres at Seymour. Now, this rain has largely eased, but as I mentioned, very much still a dangerous flood event. I'm going to run you through the current major flood warnings that are in place and a focus on some of the key areas that are of particular concern at the moment. So starting with the current major flood warnings that we do have, I just want to note that we do have other warnings in place as well, so please make sure that you're checking the Bureau's website to see what flood warnings are currently in place for your area. Major flood warnings are currently in place for the Murray River, the Avoca, the Barwon, the Broken, the Campaspe, the Goulburn River, the Loddon River, Maribyrnong, Ovens and Kings, Severn and Castle Creeks, the Wimmera, Emu Creek, And also more recently, major flood warnings have been issued for the Werribee River and the Yarra River. Now, I just want to focus on a few of those that are of particular concern. We'll start with the Murray. Barham could see major levels around Thursday. Looking at the Avoca, we'll see a peak tomorrow at Charlton Town at the major level. Along the Broken River, we're looking at Benalla, which is peaking around major right now. We're also seeing major levels around KC Weir, and we could see Orville reach the major level overnight tonight. Along the Campaspe River, Barnadown has now likely peaked, but we're seeing major flood levels at Rochester Town, and we could also see major levels at Echuca on Saturday. Looking at the Goulburn River, 12 metres is forecast at Shepparton on Tuesday, and Seymour saw record flood levels at around 3 a.m. this morning of 8.26 metres. For the King River, there's the potential that we could see major flooding at Wangaratta as well, so we're encouraging the community to keep up to date with the latest forecast and warning there. Along Severn and Castle Creeks, so the Severn Creeks, Euroa has likely peaked or is around major level right now. We're expecting that to drop below the major level today. The next area along that area is the Kialla West, so we could potentially see that getting to the major level. For Mount Emu Creek, of particular concern is Skipton, where we could see river levels reach 5.7 metres this evening, which is at the major level. Otherwise, the more recent developments in terms of the Melbourne catchments, so we still have the major flood warning in place for the Maribyrnong River, we have major flood warnings in place for the Werribee River, and most recently the Yarra River, now expected to reach 9.2 metres at Heidelberg this afternoon. So looking further ahead in terms of what we can expect longer term, we'll still see isolated showers across the state throughout today, Friday, with around about 5 to 10 millimetres. For the Melbourne area specifically, we're likely to see less than that, around about 2, though we could see isolated higher falls, particularly in the eastern suburbs. We are watching another low potentially developing over South Australia on Monday and Tuesday of next week. Now, where that heavy rain goes will be highly dependent on the movement of this system, and currently it's forecast to move across New South Wales. For Victoria, we could see some increased rainfall across northern parts from Wednesday into Thursday and Friday, but at this stage, we're more likely to be on the periphery of that system. That being said, as the Premier's already mentioned, the grounds are incredibly wet and river catchments are saturated, so we're keeping a close eye on the potential for any further rain across these areas. Please make sure that you're staying up to date with our latest forecasts and warnings through the Bureau's website and through our app. I'll now pass over to Tim Weebush, Chief Officer of Operations from the State Emergency Services, to talk in more detail around these river conditions and potential impacts. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Diana, and good afternoon, everybody. Our flood emergency here in Victoria is continuing to escalate. We've now seen the scenario in the last 24 hours where we were contending with flash flooding, where we had 12 watch and act flash flood warnings out for the metropolitan area and a range of flash flood warnings in regional Victoria that are largely now concluded. The focus is now on our river systems, and our river systems, as you've just heard from Diana, are reaching major flood levels at various times over today, through the weekend and through next week, and some of our catchments will still see major flooding well into next week. I'm going to take you through what that looks like from the west to the east of our state. So starting in the northwest of the state with the Avoca River, we're likely to see major flooding starting to occur from tonight, with a peak on Saturday afternoon at Charlton Town. And that's where we will potentially see around 40 properties that will be inundated at that point in time. This is a flood level similar to what we will have seen around September 2010. If we then move to the Loddon River, we're likely to see flood impacts downstream of Lanakuri over the coming week that are equivalent to what we saw in September 2011, if not a little bit higher. That's major flooding through townships such as Bridgewater, Serpentine and Newstead. And we've already seen impacts on community properties such as football ovals, recreation reserves, football clubs, sporting clubs and those type of things in that catchment today. On the Campaspe River, as we've been hearing in recent days, there's an evacuation warning that is out for the Rochester community. We're expecting that to peak at a level similar to what we saw in January 2011, which is a record flood level, impacting potentially over 1,000 properties. Some of those will see above floor flooding, others will be isolated for the period of 2 to 3 days. That floodwater then progresses down the Campaspe to Echuca, where we're also likely to see impacts, if not the same as January 2011, a little bit higher than at that record period of time. At this stage, the modelling is still being firmed up in terms of the number of properties that may be at risk at Echuca, and we'll be able to provide that in time. If we then move across to the northeast of the state, the Goulburn River, as you've just heard, record flooding at Seymour overnight, where an evacuation warning was in place. We've had about 50 people at the relief centre there overnight, but around 300 properties that have been impacted by floodwater and being assessed in that location. And we're likely to see major flood levels continuing through until Sunday at Seymour, and that's an equivalent level to what we saw in 1974. In fact, has exceeded that level of 1974. In the Goulburn Valley and around Shepparton District, we're likely to see some significant impacts over the coming days. And that begins on the Goulburn River at Murchison, where we're likely to see major flooding starting this evening and reaching a 12-metre height on Saturday. And then that will peak to 12.2 metres on Sunday in and around Murchison. Further down the Goulburn, we then have Kialla West, which is likely to exceed the major flood level early morning on Saturday before reaching a peak overnight on Saturday into Sunday. At Orvale, we're likely to see a height somewhere around 8.7 metres, which will be exceeded tonight, and then peak on Saturday afternoon. And then into Shepparton and Mooroopna, we're going to start to see moderate flooding from as early as Saturday morning. Why that's important? A range of key roads start to become flooded at that moderate flood level. We're then likely to see by lunchtime on Saturday that we'll start to see major flood level being reached, which is around 11 metres. But between lunchtime Saturday and Tuesday afternoon, we're going to see the Goulburn River and its tributaries, being the Broken River and Severn and Castles Creek, seeing 1 further metre in height being raised. So we get to 12 metres by Tuesday afternoon, which does mean that we will be likely to exceed the 1974 level. That means 4,000 plus properties that will either be surrounded by floodwaters, some of those being inundated above floor. So there's significant planning for evacuations and other support to those communities at this point in time, and we can't emphasise enough that people need to stay alert to their warnings and conditions in that area in particular, and I'll speak about that again in a moment. Continuing on, in the northeast of the state is the Severn and Castles Creek. As you've heard, we've seen the peak at Euroa with around 20 properties that have been impacted there. On the Broken River at Benalla, we've seen a peak similar to what we've seen in 1993, where around 50 properties have now been inundated by floodwaters, and there's been floodwaters through some of the main streets of Benalla. With the Broken River being in major flood, the Broken Creek will also become a challenge for the townships of Numurkah and Nathalia in the coming days, but it's still a little bit too early for the modelling for those communities, but we are expecting to see impacts in Numurkah and Nathalia sometime next week. All of those northern tributaries, as we've spoken about before, feed into the Murray River. The Murray River continues to be at moderate flooding from Albury down to Tocumwal, and we're expecting as the Campaspe, the Loddon, the Avoca, the Midda and King and Ovens rivers start to feed into the Murray, that we will see prolonged flooding all the way through to the South Australian border over several weeks, and so those communities will see various peaks and at various times in the next 4 weeks. Coming back to the southern parts of Victoria, the Maribyrnong River, this morning we had a major flood warning issued at around about 2:30 a.m. That was as a result of significant rainfall at the upper ends of the catchment around Deep Lead, and then coinciding with the high tide this morning. We've had around about 100 properties, we believe, that have now been impacted in one way or another in and around that low-lying areas of Maribyrnong Township and also Ascot Vale, and also a small number around Keilor itself. The good news is that that has now peaked and we will start to see the Maribyrnong receding this afternoon. The Werribee River has now been put on major flood alert, where we're likely to see a peak this afternoon at around 6 p.m, but major flooding ensuing from around 2 o'clock this afternoon, where again 70 properties will come under direct threat, along with a local shopping strip around Cottrell Road. Then if we go across to the Yarra River, an emergency warning for major flooding in and around Heidelberg has been issued. We're going to see a number of impacts there to local sporting facilities and also recreation reserves already, in addition to the bike paths and walking paths that we've seen in recent days. And then across to Mount Emu Creek, we're expecting a peak at Skipton this afternoon and through tomorrow, where we will see the Midland Highway being cut and also 12 properties along with a shopping strip that will be impacted there. And finally, the Lee and the Barwon Rivers converge at Inverleigh. We're likely to see flooding in and around the Inverleigh Township this afternoon into tomorrow, where isolations may occur, but we're not expecting above floor. On the Lee River, we have seen a dozen properties that have been impacted by major flooding, including the local school and church at Shelford. And then that will converge down into Geelong, where at this stage the Bureau is forecasting moderate flooding, which will see impacts in and around the caravan parks, recreation reserves and some sporting facilities as well. So as you can see, there's not many parts of Victoria that aren't experiencing major flooding over these coming days. We can't emphasise enough not to drive through flash flood waters. We've disappointingly seen over 200 flood rescues now that have had to be undertaken by our fire, police and SES crews. If we see further impacts in these coming days, we're going to see more roads being closed. So please go to the Vic Traffic website or download the Vic Traffic app and make sure that you're planning your travel. If you're in the northern parts of the state, please consider whether you need to travel over these coming days, given the significant number of roads, which exceeds 200 of our main arterial roads here in Victoria at the moment. And finally, if you do find yourselves in need of flood and storm emergency assistance, please call 132 500, but if it is a life-threatening emergency, please call 000. Now going to pass over to Emergency Management Commissioner Andrew Crisp just to make some closing remarks.
Thanks very much, Tim. So this is a major emergency for the state of Victoria, and in support of that, we're in here at the State Control Centre. We're activated to Tier 3, which is our highest level of readiness, and we'll continue at Tier 3 for the foreseeable future. The team here is working with and supporting 8 regional control centres and 8 incident control centres at the moment that are out there on the ground doing this great work, coordinating, working with community to keep our community safe, because that's what it's all about. As you can see, there are a lot of people in here at the State Control Centre, and those are not just people that are representing emergency services, government departments and other agencies. We do have representatives from the Commonwealth in here, from the Australian Defence Force and the National Emergency Management Agency. With the Australian Defence Force, under local arrangements, we do have defence personnel that have been deployed into the northeast of the state that are supporting into Shepparton and Murchison with moving sandbags and filling sandbags. With the scenario that Tim has just outlined in relation to Shepparton and that Goulburn region, we will continue our discussions with the ADF and look at whatever support is required, again, to keep our communities safe. This is a major emergency, and at a time like this, we do consider a state of disaster for the Minister and myself to provide advice to the Premier. At this point in time, whilst it is a major emergency, everyone is working very well together. There is great cooperation, great collaboration. When it comes to a state of disaster, the powers that we look at in relation to is the suspension of legislation, acquiring property to do certain things, or to force evacuations. We are managing this emergency without a declaration. We will continue to monitor that over the coming days and weeks. Importantly, as the Premier did touch on earlier, it's important to support those people that are impacted by this flood event. So those personal hardship assistance payments are part of the disaster recovery funding arrangements. We will be writing, we've already been speaking with the National Emergency Management Agency and the Commonwealth in relation to those arrangements. We will be writing formally to the National Emergency Management Agency today to activate those shared funding arrangements between the state and the Commonwealth. Not declaring a state of disaster has no impact whatsoever in relation to those arrangements. I would also like to acknowledge and thank the incredible work by all our emergency services, volunteers, paid, but other, we have Diana Eadie with us today, so the Bureau, the critical role they're playing in support of us. Organisations like the Red Cross, the Victorian Council of Churches, we've seen it over the last few years. We saw it in the 2019-20 floods, fires, people coming together, supporting each other. It's a huge sector. And as I always say, if we all work to the very best of our ability, we'll get through this, and I know we will get through this.
Very good. We're happy to take any questions you have.
Just on that point, Commissioner, what is the threshold for a state of disaster to be called?
It's in relation to where there is a requirement to actually use those powers. It will be continued to be explored over coming days, but at this point in time, that there is no need to acquire property, there's no need to suspend legislation to do certain things, and there's no need to force the evacuation of people. People are working very collaboratively and cooperatively in relation to that.
Can you see any circumstance under which you would need to call a state of disaster? Are there some communities that are reluctant to follow it?
We're not finding that at the moment. The Premier did touch on, and this is not just about the event over the last few days. Tim Wiebush and the SES have been talking about this. We've been talking about this for months in relation to La Nina. So again, great cooperation between local communities, local emergency services, and it's working really well.
Victorians who are at relief centres or who are away from their homes, how long can they expect to be away from their homes for?
I'll say that there's an unknown in relation to that at the moment. You know, whilst we know with the weather we've seen over the last couple of days, we are undertaking those initial impact assessments at the moment, flying across these areas to see what the actual impact is. It will take some time to actually determine for certain, you know, it'll be area by area as to when people can go back. For some people, it'll be a lot quicker than others, but we'll continue to work on this to ensure that people are supported when they're out of their home, but to get them back as soon as they can.
You mentioned you've been planning and expecting because of La Nina. Did you plan and expect for it to be as widespread statewide from one end of the state to the other?
In recent times, we ran an exercise in here at the State Control Centre, and we were actually working to a scenario similar to what we're seeing now in relation to Shepparton and that area.
The community of Charlton experienced major flooding in 2011. Residents there say that there's no one to help, and floodwaters arriving sharply. So I don't know what is help going there.
Look, our emergency services, both the CFA and SES, have been in Charlton, and there's sandbag collection points that are established there. There's a community meeting that, if it hasn't occurred already, is occurring in the next short period of time to, again, provide as best information as we can on what we're likely to see in Charlton in these coming days. And there are local flood guides there that now help those communities to understand at various heights what we can expect, which again weren't there in 2010-11.
Some of the SES people on the ground in Werribee in particular, around Melbourne, saying they're having real problems with resources at the moment.
Look, there's no doubt right across the state our volunteers, our emergency services are being stretched. We still have sufficient resources to be able to respond to the calls that we're receiving throughout the day, and some of that is being hampered by people attempting to drive through floodwaters. Every time we see a person drive into floodwaters, it's another helicopter tied up, it's another search and rescue crew that is tied up either from the SES, the police or the fire services, and we can't emphasise enough what impact that is having on our emergency services as well.
Are you also being hampered by the problem with the trucks as well?
Look, the vehicles that we've had offline for SES obviously isn't ideal, but at the same time it only represents around 10% of our fleet. And so we have been able to put additional vehicles back into our fleet in recent days to supplement what is occurring there. And certainly for our storm and flood response, we certainly still have vehicles available to be able to provide the response we need to.
I think you said earlier that the key declaration around Werribee River went out at 2:30 a.m. Some of the residents were saying on radio and in newspapers today that they only got told at 5 and 6 a.m. and they had no advance warning yesterday that it could be this serious. Was it not known yesterday that there was a very serious risk around that river?
So as early as Tuesday, we were door knocking the community in and around the Werribee River to advise them of the potential risk of flooding in their area. We then had a watch and act for moderate flooding that was in place to indicate that there was the risk, and that progressively got increased over the 24 hours that then preceded that. This morning, the Bureau issued a major flood warning at around 2:30 a.m. That was then preceded with an evacuation warning that was issued around 5:30 this morning, and emergency services were out door knocking again those communities to make sure that, obviously being in the middle of the night, people are able to know that it's time to move.
Was it potentially the case that if the flooding was more widespread than first believed, were some houses door knocked and others that were further out not door knocked? Why were some only informed this morning that it was going to be this serious?
Look, I guess some of those properties, it's all based on modelling. So in this particular scenario, what we've seen is rainfall that exceeded the initial forecasts. We also saw it coinciding with the high tide this morning. So those factors together always means that no two floods are the same. And so in this scenario, many of the properties that were most at risk had been door knocked earlier, had also had watch and act messages out. And I can't emphasise enough to Victorians that part of our warning system is all about an escalated response. So if you are under a watch and act warning right at this time, those words mean exactly that. We're asking you to watch and monitor your conditions. We're asking you to be prepared to act, because it could be, with this dynamic situation, that very quickly we move to an emergency warning or an evacuation warning.
You've touched on what I'm trying to ask. So you're saying that the rainfall was worse and it exceeded modelling, and therefore some houses that now have been flooded were not door knocked?
I couldn't tell you which houses may not have been door knocked that have been impacted, but what I can say is there's been warnings out for those communities for several days to be alert to their conditions and to be ready to take action if required.
Have you had much resistance to evacuation? Like we hear, for instance, in Rochester, half the town remain.
Look, across Victoria, people make personal choices, and what I can say is we've seen a really good response by Victorians in the main to the warnings that are being issued. We're seeing people move en masse to family and friends, to relocate to higher parts of their community to make sure that they can stay safe. And that's exactly what we're asking people to do, particularly when we start to see those emergency warnings or evacuation warnings. Make sure you have a plan now. We are starting to see, because of the rainfall, because of the saturation of the catchments and water storages that are spilling for the first time in many decades, responses on our river systems that haven't been seen for decades.
Has there been any residents around Werribee that have been stuck in their homes and unable to be rescued?
To the best of my knowledge, there have been a few rescues that have been undertaken in that area this morning, but I'm not aware of anybody that has not been able to be provided assistance in that area.
Have we seen any injuries as part of any of those rescues?
Look, fortunately, we haven't seen any serious injuries at this stage. Just before coming into this media conference, we did have a report of a missing person at Newbridge, and search and rescue crews are out there at the moment between Victoria Police, SES and our fire service.
Where's Newbridge?
Newbridge is on the Loddon River, but up around to the west of Bendigo.
What were the situation around that missing person? Do we know any details about where they were last seen?
No, look, details are still fairly sketchy. The report had just come in as we were walking into the media conference here this afternoon.
Can I ask the Premier, when are you expecting Mickleham to be up and running as a relief centre?
Sure. Well, we want to make sure that Mickleham is ready to provide accommodation to anyone who needs it. There are several hundred families that can potentially be accommodated there, and we'll have to monitor the situation, but all necessary work is being done now, and I'll look forward to updating you tomorrow about the progress that we've made. But we've got agreement from the Commonwealth, who own the place. We are reactivating some contracts that had been related to quarantine activity, and we'll have an update for you tomorrow.
But you would expect it will definitely be needed and needed for an extended period of time?
It is possible. It is possible. And the best thing for us to do, on the best advice, is to stand that up so that if it is needed, and I think that is likely, we can't be certain, but I think that is likely, and it's very good to have an option. Some of the numbers that we're talking about, for instance, in the Goulburn Valley, would, I think, far exceed the number of hotel rooms, for instance, that might be available. So having an option for people, whether it be for a short stay or for a longer stay, because of this ground being so wet, record rainfall and more rain coming, so people may be out of their home for a longer period of time than, say, with other floods, this is a really important option for us to have. I'd give you the full update now, but we're just doing the work. It started last night, and I hope to have more to say tomorrow.
And have you sort of set a figure of how many people you want to be able to be in there?
It's a little bit dependent upon family structures and things of that nature, but I think you've got one part of the facility is about 250 families, and then there's a second that can be stood up as well. So that's the range. Whether they'd all be needed, whether they were all needed at the same time, and all the different details and circumstances, all of that work is being done, and I'm very grateful to our officials and officials from the Commonwealth who've worked very late into last night and have started again first thing this morning. And I thank the Prime Minister again for his agreement to utilise that insurance policy. Let's hope we don't need to put anybody there, but we're going to have it ready so that it can be used for that.
I mean, will any campaigning for activities at state election be toned down from your party, or is later spoken to the other side about this?
No, that'd be a matter for the party. I'm here today to talk about floods, and that'll be my focus.
Sorry, can I just clarify, how many emergency workers in total have been deployed across the state?
There's around 2,000 is my most recent advice, and workers is the best term. Some are paid, many are volunteers. That doesn't include council. That also doesn't include a whole lot of charity groups that are out doing their really important work as well. And then there are people that are not necessarily a member of any of those groups. They're just helping neighbours, family and friends, and we say thank you to all of them.
Are we anticipating loss of life here?
I have no advice to say that that's something that we should anticipate. But again, as we just saw moments before we walked in today, there's a person that's missing. As soon as we can provide you with further information, and hopefully that's because the person's been found safe and well. But again, it's often, look, I think communities that are flooded know this, but I'll just make the point anyway. It is so dangerous to drive into this floodwater or to be in this floodwater when you don't need to be, playing in it, walking through it. This is a really serious event, and we have to take it really seriously. Otherwise, people can be very serious consequences, and not just for the person who makes that decision to try and drive through water because they believe they can get through, but also the person or persons who have to come and rescue them. That's if it works well. Can be a lot more serious than that. People can lose their lives doing this. So we just ask again, please don't do that, for your sake and the sake of the person who'll have to come to your aid.
I know we can't predict the weather, but do you expect...
Well, on that point, all of us have views about the Bureau. The Bureau have forecast this with a great degree of precision, and I just want to give a shout out to the staff. They work very, very hard. It's 24/7. They do their very best, and the way in which they forecast this unprecedented rainfall event unfolding has been pretty much true to what has occurred. And the challenge to Nick's earlier question, these record rains, together with the fact that the ground is just so wet, has meant that we've got a unique event. But I want to thank the Bureau for their skill and for the hard work that they put in.
Having been briefed on all that forecasting, do you expect that we'll have days kind of as bad as this? Is this going to get worse? Should we expect more days like
I don't think, well, I certainly haven't been briefed on a forecast that has the sort of record rainfall that we have experienced over these last couple of days. But again, there's a cumulative or aggregate impact here. This flood event started with very wet ground, very full catchments and record rain. That's our new starting point. We will have more rain, and it may be that in some communities, not necessarily everywhere that's flooded now, but in some communities, even a minor rainfall event in a week or two may well mean that some people are impacted, that flood is back on in that local community. And that may mean that people are isolated, it may mean some people are flooded in their house. Every circumstance will be unique. But when we say this is not kind of start Thursday, finish Tuesday, Wednesday the following week, that's what we mean. This is going to be with us for some time. So managing fatigue amongst our emergency services, making sure that everybody has that sense of urgency all the way through, and that we don't become really, as a Victorian community, fatigued by this, which is perfectly understandable, is a really important part of it.
Some towns have their worst levels since 1974, others 2011. Do we know how overall this compares to previous floods, or is it too early to say?
Probably a bit too early to say, but I think that the reason we had, as soon as weather allowed, we've had aircraft up today making damage assessments, making impact assessments. I think this is going to finish up being, in terms of property damage, road, public infrastructure, and just the sheer volume of water, I think this is going to set new records.
We haven't had a flood like this in Victoria. We've been watching interstate
indeed.
in the last couple of years. What do you think this might do to the kind of immediate conception of the impacts of climate change among the population in Victoria?
Well, a couple of points. Firstly, we want to thank our interstate colleagues. Even despite the challenges they face, they're offering support. They're working with us just as we do with them. So it's everyone working together, and I think the community is absolutely reassured by that. I certainly am, to know that the Commonwealth Government, as soon as I rang the Prime Minister, whatever you need, that's what he said. So I'm very grateful for that. In terms of learnings, obviously New South Wales has had their own, and Queensland, their own flood events. There's been some learnings out of New South Wales that have already been embedded in the response and the work that SES and EMV and all of our emergency services agencies have put in these last few months. So that should be a reassurance to the community as well. We're always looking for that continuous improvement. On issues of climate change, Paul, my views on that are well known. I don't need to go back through that today, and I don't necessarily know that today's the day to do that.
Why stay off that?
Well, I'm much more focused on helping people and supporting people and keeping people safe, rather than having a policy debate about climate change. My views are well known on climate change. It's why we are the centre of renewable energy in our nation, and it's why we have made a raft of policy reforms. I just don't think today's the day to be getting into a debate on policy. Today's the day to be helping people, keeping people safe, and issuing those appropriate warnings, and making sure that everyone knows that if you need a grant for assistance, it's there for you. If you need sandbags, there's 50 locations to go to. If you need to go to a relief centre, there's 11 of those open right now. The list goes on.
Do you expect more relief centres will happen?
I think there will be, yeah. I think almost certainly when we think about communities like the Golden Valley, some of those communities that Tim mentioned before, not just in the Golden Valley but in many different parts of the state, where there's not a need for a relief centre today, there'll be additional relief centres opened.
You expected to visit the flood zone?
Myself, the Minister, and Commissioner Crisp will be out on the ground today.
Do you have, at this stage, where you in
I think we'll be heading to the Golden Valley, but we'll, en route, we'll have a look at some of the other flood zones on the way up.
Can I ask Diana a similar question to Paul?
Absolutely.
And that, does the Bureau's modelling indicate that these sorts of events will continue over summer?
In terms of what we know with the climate outlook, of course, the ground is incredibly wet, dams are already full, and all climate indicators are suggesting that we'll see a continuation of above average rainfall, certainly for the remainder of spring for Victoria, but potentially into the start of summer as well. And that's associated with the third La Nina in a row, which is certainly impacting Victoria, and that's leading to that potential for above average rainfall across the state.
Any indication that it could be something as dramatic as we've had over the past couple of days?
In terms of the next 7 days, we are monitoring that low pressure system, which has the potential to bring further rainfall across the north of the state. But at this stage, we're not suggesting that we'll see the same magnitude of rainfall that we've just seen recently. Longer term, what we do know is the ground is wet. We know that dams are full, so any further rain will potentially cause significant flooding. In terms of the heaviest rain, we'll have more confidence about that in terms of the 7-day outlook. And when we start to see events that could be similar to what we've just seen, we'll be sure to make sure that the community and our emergency services partners are informed.
Are you concerned that the Northern Hospital can now take even fewer patients because hospital beds are closed and there are staff shortages?
I don't know that that's the case. I think that Northern Hospital are the people to talk to there. Northern Hospital have 45% more staff today than they did the day that we were elected. The staff out there, I've been there many, many times, and I want to give a shout out to all of the nurses, the midwives, the ambos that come and go from that hospital, the whole team out there, the doctors, they do an amazing job. They were under acute pressure like every hospital was a few months ago when we had thousands of staff away sick with COVID or caring for someone who was sick with COVID. We've seen improvements across the board at just about, well, I think at every hospital really, there are far less people that are away sick today. So I don't know that is necessarily an accurate description, and the best way to clarify that matter is for you to talk to the hospital, who'll be able to speak to you about exactly who's at work, who isn't, and what services are being offered. Northern's a busy hospital, and the reason it's a busy hospital is because it's got record funding and amazing staff, and I want to thank each and every one of them, and there are 45% more of them since we came to office.
Minutes of a meeting with both hospital executives said staff are being asked to take huge clinical risks, and it's a matter of when a patient will die, not you.
Well, as I said, you need to have. I don't know when that meeting was held. I wasn't at that meeting. I wasn't at that meeting. We're always concerned to make sure that every patient gets the very best care. That's why we have always invested in additional funding, additional resources, equipment, new buildings, and extra staff. We've recruited 26,000 additional staff into our hospital system over the last 8 years, and we'll do even more over the next 4. But that, of course, is dependent upon outcomes in about a month's time. Again, I would just say Northern Hospital are probably best placed to talk to you about that meeting, what was said, what wasn't, when that meeting occurred. I'm not sure whether that meeting was held, for instance, in the middle of winter when things were very, very challenging at every single hospital and for every business and for every family in many ways. Just the sheer number of cases that we had impacted lots of different parts of our economy, our community, and of course the services that we deliver.
That's just a quick one on floods.
Sure.
I know it's not the most immediate concern, but there'll be significant road damage.
There will be, yes.
Have you started thinking about whether there will be kind of a road repair package? What might that look like and how expensive?
Sure. I've just come from a Security and Emergency Management Committee of Cabinet where the Roads Minister, Minister Carroll, and the Treasurer and the committee have agreed to some additional funding. We'll make announcements about that quite soon. But we will move money within programs to make sure that we can respond as quickly as possible. Money will not be the issue, Paul. We've got about $800 million out there now from the last budget for road maintenance. Certainly high 700s. I haven't got the exact figure, but 780, something like that. Ultimately, it's not the money or the workforce, it's about weather. And we had dry weather, then we've had a prolonged period of wet weather. And you get into this situation where you put the bitumen down and without the proper dry weather for it to cure, traffic over it just rips it up again. So I know it's really challenging. That's been the only limiting factor to get more and more of those potholes fixed. Not money, not will. It's been all about weather. Indeed, that's right. And of course, that will still be a factor because just as our ground is very wet, so too is our road network and shoulders and all of those issues. So as soon as we can get in there, we will first make assessments and then, weather dependent, we'll get on and repair the damage that's been done and proceed with our maintenance agenda, which had been somewhat delayed because of the weather we had pre this extreme event. There are disaster funding arrangements with the Commonwealth. First step there to the last part of your question, how much will it cost? You've got to do the assessments first, then you sit down with goodwill, best engineering advice, and you work through a partnership agreement with the Commonwealth to get on and get that work done. There will not be a moment's delay in doing that. Money won't be a limiting factor, workforce won't be a limiting factor. The only limiting factor is weather. And I think people see that firsthand today with so many parts of our state in flood.
Can you just describe the reports that have been briefed up to Cabinet on what's happened to roads in the past couple of days?
No, because I don't have that in front of me, but I'm more than happy to get you an update of the number of roads we think have been impacted, the number of roads that are closed, any early assessments we can give you on damage. We're only too happy to share that. It's just a matter of the fact that the choppers and planes are literally in the air now, trying to make assessments about that, as well as people on the ground where it's safe. They're making those same assessments as well.
Just to be clear, disaster payments don't require the
Correct.
disaster declaration.
Correct. So just to put it another way, The moment Commissioner Crisp believes that Minister Symes should be given quite extraordinary powers, he will advise me, and I will give those, and I will sign off, and those powers will move to the Emergency Services Minister. There will not be a moment's delay. They are quite significant powers, though. At this stage, no such advice has come forward because there's no need to do that. If there was a need, then the advice would come forward. That's always been EMV's position. Right now, that's not needed, and nothing is dependent upon that. Nothing's been delayed or held up. For instance, there's some 1,500, and that was half an hour ago when we started talking to you. It will have grown. There are many hundreds, indeed it'll now be, I think, multiple thousands of people who have already applied for those grants, and we'll get those paid as fast as we can. It's just over $2,000, and it's about supporting people who are doing it very tough, out of their home. It provides accommodation, food, clothing, medicine, all of those things, just as one example. Any other issues? If not, thank you all very much.
Thank you.